The rain had been falling for nearly an hour, turning the empty highway into a blur of headlights and reflections. Most drivers kept their eyes forward, eager to get home before the storm got any worse. On the side of the road, a black luxury SUV sat with its hazard lights flashing. One of its tires had blown out, leaving the expensive vehicle completely stranded. Standing beside it was a woman who looked like she belonged on the cover of a business magazine. She wore a tailored charcoal coat over an elegant suit, and although the rain had soaked her clothes and hair, she refused to let anyone see panic on her face. Her name was Victoria Bennett, one of the most respected CEOs in the country. She had built a reputation for making billion-dollar decisions without showing emotion. Employees described her as brilliant but impossible to read. She trusted numbers more than people, and kindness had become something she believed only existed when someone wanted something in return. One car after another sped past without slowing down. Some drivers looked her way but nobody stopped. Victoria folded her arms and quietly muttered, "Figures." Then in the distance an old pickup truck slowed down. It wasn't shiny, it wasn't expensive. In fact, it looked like it had seen better days. The truck pulled onto the shoulder and a tired-looking man stepped out. His work boots were covered in dust and his jacket carried the marks of a long day on the job. This was Daniel Carter, a hardworking single father who had just finished a 12-hour shift. All he wanted was to get home to his 10-year-old daughter, Emma, who was waiting for him with dinner. Money was tight, bills were piling up, and every extra minute mattered. Still, when Daniel saw someone stranded alone in the rain, he couldn't drive away. He walked over with a calm smile and asked, "Looks like you could use a hand." Victoria barely looked at him. She assumed he was just another roadside mechanic trying to earn a quick payment. Without even asking his name, she simply pointed toward the damaged tire. Daniel didn't argue. He knelt on the wet pavement and began changing the tire while cold rain poured over his back. He never complained once. When the job was finished, Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of cash. Daniel shook his head and smiled. "Keep it," he said softly. "If my daughter was ever stuck out here alone, I'd pray someone would stop for her too." He climbed back into his old truck and drove away without another word. Victoria stood there watching his taillights disappear into the rain. For the first time in years, someone had helped her without asking for anything. She had no idea that less than 24 hours later, she would walk into the company where that same man worked and change his life forever. Daniel Carter had never imagined that life would turn out this way. 5 years earlier, he had been the kind of man who always laughed a little louder, dreamed a little bigger, and believed that as long as he worked hard, everything would be okay. But cancer had taken his wife far too soon, leaving him alone to raise their 10-year-old daughter, Emma. Since the day he buried the woman he loved, Daniel had carried 2 full-time jobs without ever being paid for both. During the day, he worked as an operations manager at a manufacturing company, solving problems, keeping production on schedule, and making sure his team had everything they needed. At home, he became a father, a mother, a teacher, a cook, and his daughter's biggest supporter. Every morning before sunrise, he made Emma breakfast, packed her lunch, braided her hair the best he could, and walked her to the school bus with a smile that hid the pressure he felt inside. After that, he drove to work in his old pickup truck, the same truck he had owned for nearly 15 years. It rattled every time it started, but Daniel always joked that it still had a few good miles left in it. His co-workers respected him because he never asked anyone to do work he wouldn't do himself. If someone stayed late, Daniel stayed with them. If a new employee struggled, he was the first to offer help. Even when upper management ignored his ideas or gave credit to someone else, he never complained. To Daniel, doing the right thing mattered more than getting applause. Still, life wasn't easy. Every paycheck disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Rent, groceries, school supplies, electricity, and medical bills left very little behind. Some nights after Emma went to sleep, Daniel quietly sat at the kitchen table with a calculator, trying to figure out which bill could wait another week. Yet no matter how hard things became, he made one promise to himself. Emma would never feel poor. She might not have the newest phone or expensive clothes, but she would always feel safe, loved, and believed in. That little girl was the reason he kept getting up every morning. Before leaving for work each day, Emma always hugged him and reminded him of something her mother used to say. "Dad," she smiled, "kind people never stay unnoticed forever." Daniel would laugh softly, kiss her forehead, and tell her, "I hope you're right, sweetheart." He had no idea those simple words were about to come true much sooner than either of them could ever imagine. Victoria Bennett hadn't become one of the country's most successful CEOs by trusting people easily. She had built Bennett Capital from a small investment firm into a business empire worth billions of dollars. Every decision she made was based on facts, numbers, and results, never feelings. Inside the office, employees respected her, but very few truly knew her. She rarely smiled during meetings, expected excellence from everyone around her, and believed that emotions often got in the way of good business. Years earlier, she had trusted the wrong business partners, and their betrayal had cost her more than money. It had changed the way she looked at people. Since then, Victoria believed that most acts of kindness came with hidden motives. If someone offered help, she assumed they wanted a favor in return. If someone praised her, she expected them to ask for something later. That belief had followed her for years. On the evening she became stranded on the highway, she was actually returning from a confidential meeting. Bennett Capital was close to buying a struggling manufacturing company, and Victoria had spent the entire day reviewing financial reports and meeting with lawyers. Her mind was focused on contracts and negotiations, not knowing that a simple act of kindness from a tired single father was about to challenge everything she thought she knew about people. The rain continued to pour as strong winds shook the trees along the highway. Daniel quietly placed the spare tire beside Victoria's SUV and got to work without wasting a second. The cold water soaked through his jacket, and his hands quickly became covered with mud and grease, but he never complained. Victoria stood a few feet away, watching him in silence. She glanced at her expensive watch every few minutes, clearly frustrated by the delay. To her, this was just another problem that needed to be solved. She barely spoke, only answering Daniel's questions with short replies. "Turn the wheel a little," he said politely. She did. "That should do it." Within 15 minutes, Daniel had removed the damaged tire and secured the spare. Before lowering the vehicle, he checked the pressure twice to make sure it was safe enough to reach the nearest service station. He stepped back, wiped the rain from his face, and smiled. "You'll be fine now, but I'd replace that tire as soon as you can." Victoria reached into her designer handbag, pulled out several $100 bills and held them toward him. "Take it," she said. "You've earned it." Daniel looked at the money for a moment before gently shaking his head. "I appreciate it, ma'am, but I can't accept it." Victoria frowned, surprised. "Why not?" she asked. Daniel leaned against his old pickup truck and answered with complete honesty. "Because one day my little girl might need help from a stranger. If she's ever alone on the side of the road, I hope someone stops for her without thinking about money first." For the first time that evening, Victoria didn't know what to say. She slowly lowered her hand, still holding the cash. Daniel wished her a safe trip, climbed back into his old truck and drove away into the rain. Victoria remained standing beside her SUV, watching his taillights disappear down the dark highway. She had met thousands of people during her career, but none had walked away from her money without hesitation. She didn't even know his name, yet something about that tired single father stayed on her mind long after the storm had passed. That night, Victoria Bennett made it home, but sleep never came. She changed into comfortable clothes, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat alone in the quiet living room of her beautiful home. Normally, after a long business trip, she would review reports or prepare for the next day's meetings. But this time, her thoughts kept returning to the man on the highway. She couldn't understand why a complete stranger had refused so much money after standing in the cold rain to help her. In her world, every favor had a price. Every handshake usually led to a business deal, and every act of kindness came with expectations. But Daniel had wanted nothing. He had simply helped her and driven away. His words echoed in her mind again and again. "If my daughter was ever stranded, I hope someone would stop for her." Those words felt real because they came from the heart, not from someone trying to impress her. Early the next morning before sunrise, Victoria called her executive assistant. "I need you to find the man who helped me last night," she said. Using the highway incident report and traffic camera records, her team identified Daniel Carter within a few hours. They discovered he worked as an operations manager at a manufacturing company that Bennett Capital was already planning to acquire. Curious, Victoria asked for the company's employee reports instead of just its financial records. As she read through them, she noticed something unusual. Department after department struggled with low morale and poor leadership, but one name kept appearing in positive employee feedback: Daniel Carter. Workers described him as honest, fair, dependable, and someone who always put people before himself. Victoria leaned back in her chair and slowly smiled. For the first time, she wasn't interested in the company because of its profits. She wanted to meet the man whose character had impressed both strangers on a rainy highway and the people who worked beside him every single day. Later that morning, Victoria cancelled 2 important meetings and locked herself inside the conference room with a stack of reports about the manufacturing company. At first, everything looked normal. The financial numbers were acceptable, sales were steady, and the company appeared to be a safe investment. But Victoria had learned long ago that numbers never told the whole story. She asked her legal team to bring employee surveys, exit interviews, and internal management reports. As she turned each page, a different picture began to appear. Workers complained about managers taking credit for other people's ideas, employees being pressured to stay late without recognition, and good workers being passed over for promotions because they refused to play office politics. Several experienced employees had resigned, saying they no longer trusted senior leadership. Then Victoria noticed something that caught her attention. Every time the reports mentioned Daniel Carter, the comments completely changed. Employees called him honest, respectful, and the kind of leader who never asked others to do what he wouldn't do himself. Some wrote that he stayed after work to help struggling team members. Others said he quietly paid for lunch when a coworker was going through hard times. One employee even wrote, "If more managers were like Daniel, nobody would want to leave this company." Victoria kept reading until she reached Daniel's performance reviews. The results were outstanding year after year, yet he had never been promoted. Instead, the promotions had gone to managers with weaker records but stronger personal connections inside the company. Victoria slowly closed the file and looked at her executive team. "This company doesn't have a profit problem," she said calmly. "It has a leadership problem." Right then, she made a decision that surprised everyone in the room. She instructed her lawyers to move forward with the acquisition immediately. But this deal was no longer just about buying a company. It was about rebuilding a workplace where honesty, respect, and real leadership would finally be rewarded. The next morning started like any other day for Daniel. He dropped Emma off at school, wished her a great day, and drove to work without knowing his life was about to change forever. As soon as he walked into the building, something felt different. Small groups of employees were gathered in the hallways, whispering to one another. Rumors were spreading that the company had been sold overnight and that the new owner was coming to make a major announcement. No one knew what to expect. Some feared layoffs, while others worried their department would be shut down. A few minutes later, everyone was called into the main conference room. The room fell silent as the doors opened and several executives walked in. Then Victoria Bennett stepped through the doorway. Daniel looked up and his eyes widened in disbelief. It was the same woman whose tire he had changed in the rain just hours earlier. Victoria noticed him immediately but kept a calm expression as she walked to the front of the room. She looked around at the employees before speaking in a confident voice. "Good morning, everyone. As of 8 o'clock today, Bennett Capital has officially completed the purchase of this company." The room filled with shocked whispers. Daniel stood frozen, trying to understand what was happening. Victoria glanced at him for just a second before continuing. "Over the next few days, I will personally review every department, every manager, and every leadership decision that has shaped this company." Without realizing it, Daniel had just become the most important employee in the room. Over the next 2 days, Victoria did something the previous owners had never bothered to do. Instead of staying in the executive office, she walked through the factory floor, visited every department, and spoke directly with employees. She asked simple questions and listened carefully without interrupting. At first, many workers were nervous, afraid that being honest might cost them their jobs. But when Victoria promised that every conversation would remain confidential, people finally began telling the truth. Again and again, one name came up: Daniel Carter. Employees described him as the manager who stayed late to help others, covered shifts when someone had a family emergency, and never blamed his team when problems happened. They also revealed something far more troubling. Daniel had been recommended for promotion several times, but senior executives quietly blocked every opportunity. His reports and ideas were often presented at meetings under someone else's name, while managers who cared more about office politics than real leadership kept moving up the ladder. By the end of the investigation, Victoria had seen enough. She called an emergency meeting with the executive team and placed several senior managers on immediate administrative leave while a full review was completed. The room fell silent. Some executives looked shocked while others avoided eye contact. Victoria wasn't interested in excuses anymore. She had promised herself that if she bought this company, honesty would finally matter more than connections. And that promise was about to change Daniel Carter's life forever. The following afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected call from Victoria's assistant asking him to come to the boardroom. As he walked down the hallway, he couldn't stop wondering if he had done something wrong. He had always kept his head down, worked hard, and treated everyone with respect, but being called into a meeting with the company's new owner made him nervous. When he entered the room, Victoria was sitting at the head of the table with several board members beside her. She stood, smiled warmly, and invited Daniel to take a seat. For a moment, the room was completely quiet. Then Victoria looked at him and said, "Mr. Carter, before we discuss business, I want to thank you." Daniel looked confused. Victoria continued, "The night my car broke down, you had no idea who I was. You stood in the rain, fixed my tire, refused my money, and asked for nothing in return. That wasn't just kindness, that was character." She paused for a second before adding, "Over the last 2 days, I've spoken with your coworkers, reviewed your performance records, and learned how you've been treated inside this company. Year after year, you've delivered outstanding results, yet you've been overlooked because you refused to play politics." Several board members nodded in agreement. Victoria opened a folder and slid it across the table. "Today that ends." Daniel opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside was an official promotion letter appointing him as the company's new chief operating officer. His salary would nearly double, he would lead company operations, and Bennett Capital would also create a full education fund to cover Emma's schooling through college. Daniel looked up, speechless. For a moment he couldn't find the words. Victoria smiled and said, "Last night you changed my tire, but more importantly, you changed the way I think about leadership. A company doesn't become great because of impressive buildings or expensive offices. It becomes great because of people like you." Daniel quietly thanked her, holding back tears as he accepted the offer. At that moment, years of hard work, sacrifice, and quiet integrity were finally rewarded, not because he asked for recognition, but because someone had finally taken the time to see the man behind the job title. Daniel left the office that evening carrying nothing more than a small folder, but to him, it felt like he was carrying a whole new future. As he walked through the parking lot, several co-workers who had heard the news stopped to shake his hand. Some smiled, while others thanked him for always treating them with respect, even when nobody else did. Daniel accepted every handshake with the same humility he had always shown. He didn't celebrate by buying an expensive car or making a big announcement. Instead, he drove his old pickup truck to Emma's school, just as he had done every afternoon for years. When Emma climbed into the passenger seat, she immediately noticed the smile on her father's face. "Dad," she asked with a laugh, "what happened? You look happier than I've seen you in a long time." Daniel looked at his daughter for a moment before handing her the promotion letter. Emma slowly read the first page, then looked back at him with tears filling her eyes. "You really got promoted?" she whispered. Daniel nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, and do you remember what you always tell me before work?" Emma smiled. "Kind people never stay unnoticed forever." Daniel smiled back and quietly replied, "You were right." The two of them hugged inside that old truck, grateful not just for the promotion, but for every difficult day that had led them to that moment. A few weeks later, Victoria gathered every employee for another company meeting. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. She announced several new policies designed to rebuild trust across the company. Promotions would now be based on performance and character instead of personal connections. Every employee would have a chance to share ideas directly with leadership, and managers would be expected to earn respect instead of demanding it. Then Victoria pointed toward Daniel and said, "Real leaders don't create followers, they create better people." Daniel Carter reminded me that leadership begins with character long before it begins with a title. The entire room stood and applauded. Many employees who had once considered leaving the company decided to stay because, for the first time in years, they believed things could truly change. Months passed, and the company grew stronger than ever. Productivity increased, employee turnover dropped, and the workplace became known for treating people with fairness and respect. Daniel never forgot where he came from. Even as chief operating officer, he still walked the factory floor, greeted employees by name, and listened whenever someone needed help. Success never changed his heart because kindness had always been part of who he was. As for Victoria, she often thought back to that rainy night on the highway. She realized that the most valuable lesson of her career hadn't come from a boardroom, a business school, or a billion-dollar deal. It came from a tired single father who refused to leave a stranger stranded in the rain. Sometimes the smallest decision can change an entire life. And sometimes, the person who stops to help without expecting anything in return ends up inspiring an entire company. So if this story touched your heart, remember this one simple truth. People may forget your position, your paycheck, or your success, but they will never forget how you made them feel. Because in the end, character will always take you farther than power ever can.